How did students survive school without smoothkits? What if their textbooks were giant, handwritten scrolls of dense philosophy, law, or medicine, written in a language most people barely spoke? What if their classes involved endless debates on concepts that would make a modern astrophysicist scratch their head? From roughly 1100 to 1500, medieval students faced this exact reality. They wrestled with intellectual giants, decoding ancient wisdom and forging new ideas. Number 8. Galen's Ars Parva. Consider the world of medieval medicine, a realm where understanding the human body meant more than just memorizing symptoms. It meant delving into complex theories about humors, temperaments, and forces that influenced health and disease. For a medieval student aspiring to heal, the foundational text was Galen of Pergamon's Ars Parva, or Microgeny, which translates to the little art. This was not a simple guide to bandaging wounds or mixing herbal remedies. It was a rigorous philosophical and theoretical treatise on the principles of medicine, a dense network of definitions, divisions, and logical arguments that demanded intense concentration and mastery of medical logic. Galen, a physician who lived in the Roman Empire in the 2nd century Common Era, became the undisputed authority in medicine for over 1,000 years. His Ars Parva served as an entry point into his vast medical system, but it was far from simple. It presented a systematic outline of medicine, dividing the field into its constituent parts, such as the natural, non-natural, and contranatural causes. The student was expected to understand what Galen meant by natural faculties, like attraction, retention, concoction, and expulsion, and how these related to the body's various organs and functions. This required not just memory, but a conceptual grip on Galen's entire physiological framework. One of the central concepts in the Ars Parva was the theory of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Galen argued that these humors, derived from food and circulating throughout the body, needed to be in perfect balance for health, and imbalance led to disease. Students had to learn the qualities associated with each humor, blood being hot and moist, phlegm cold and moist, yellow bile hard and dry, and black bile cold and dry, and how these related to the 4 temperaments. Choleric person, for example, was understood to have an excess of yellow bile, making them prone to anger and a hot disposition. Understanding this system meant internalizing a complex interplay of qualities, humors, organs, and diseases. The Ars Parva was structured in a question-and-answer format in some manuscripts, and often presented as a series of aphorisms or short, dense statements that required extensive commentary. Teachers known as masters would lecture on each aphorism, breaking down its meaning and drawing connections to other parts of Galen's work and to Aristotelian philosophy, which provided the logical backbone for medieval medical thought. Students were not just reading the text, they were engaging with generations of accumulated interpretations and debates. The work itself is relatively short, but its brevity belied its depth. Every sentence carried a weight of meaning, often relying on precise Greek philosophical terms translated into Latin, which could sometimes lose nuance. Students spent countless hours memorizing the definitions of health and disease, the different kinds of causes, and the classifications of symptoms. They had to learn about things that preserve health, things that damage it, and things that restore it. Galen stated that medicine was a science of things healthy, things sickly, and things neutral. This sounds simple, but each category had intricate subdivisions and examples. For instance, things neutral included conditions like wounds or fractures which were neither strictly healthy nor sickly, but could lead to sickness. Mastery meant not only recalling the definitions, but being able to apply them to hypothetical cases and discuss their implications. The logical structure of Galen's argument also posed a significant challenge. The Ars Parva used syllogistic reasoning, a form of deductive logic derived from Aristotle. Students were expected to follow these logical steps to understand the premises and conclusions and to identify potential fallacies. For example, Galen might argue that all fever is an excess of heat, and if a patient has an excess of heat, then they have a fever. Students were not just learning medical facts, they were learning a method of medical reasoning. This meant training their minds in abstract thought, moving from general principles to specific cases and back again. The book was a primer in medical epistemology, a guide to how medical knowledge was acquired and validated. Furthermore, students learned Galen not in isolation but alongside other foundational texts in the medical curriculum, including works by Hippocrates and later Arabic commentators like Avicenna and Rhazes. Task was to synthesize these different perspectives, reconcile apparent contradictions, and apply this theoretical framework to practical situations. The Ars Parva was the conceptual lens through which all other medical knowledge was viewed. Without a firm grasp of Galen's fundamental principles, the more advanced medical texts and clinical observations would remain unintelligible. The mastery of this little art was a formidable undertaking, a testament to the rigorous intellectual training required to become a medieval physician. Number 7. Ptolemy's Almagest. Imagine a world without telescopes or satellites, where the cosmos was a grand, mysterious sphere, with Earth at its fixed center. For medieval students of astronomy, grasping the movements of celestial bodies meant confronting the intellectual giant known as Ptolemy, specifically his monumental work, the Almagest. This was not a book for the faint of heart. It was a complex, mathematically dense treatise that codified ancient Greek astronomy and planetary theory, offering a geocentric model of the universe that would dominate Western and Islamic thought for over 14 centuries. Claudius Ptolemy, a Greek astronomer and mathematician living in Alexandria in the 2nd century Common Era, wrote the Almagest as a comprehensive synthesis of astronomical knowledge. Its original title was Mathematique Syntaxis, meaning mathematical treatise, but it later became known as the Great Treatise, and eventually the Greatest Treatise, or Almagest in Arabic. Its sheer length and intricate mathematical detail were daunting. The work is divided into 13 books, each building upon the previous one, presenting a coherent system for predicting the positions of the sun, moon, and planets. A significant challenge was the mathematical prerequisite. The Almagest is steeped in geometry and trigonometry, areas that medieval students would have studied, but Ptolemy applied them to astronomical problems in innovative ways. Students had to understand and apply chord functions, a predecessor to modern sine functions, to calculate angles and distances in the celestial sphere. They learned how to construct intricate geometric models to explain planetary motions, not just memorize results. For example, Ptolemy dedicated significant sections to the calculation of solar and lunar eclipses, which involved precise geometric constructions and knowledge of the relative sizes and distances of the Earth, Moon, and Sun. The core of Ptolemy's system was the geocentric model, where the Earth stood still at the center of the universe, and all other celestial bodies revolved around it. To account for the observed irregularities in planetary motion, such as retrograde motion, the apparent backward movement of planets against the background stars, Ptolemy introduced the concepts of epicycles and deference. Planet was imagined to move in a small circle called an epicycle, while the center of this epicycle moved along a larger circle called a deferent, which was centered on the Earth. Sometimes, to further refine the model, Ptolemy introduced the equant, a point around which the center of the deferent moved uniformly, but which was offset from the Earth. Understanding and calculating with these nested and offset circles required intense spatial reasoning and algebraic manipulation, even without modern algebraic notation. Consider the complexity of a single planetary model. For Mars, Ptolemy had to account for its varying brightness, its retrograde loops, and its non-uniform speed. His model for Mars involved a deferent, an epicycle, and an equant, all precisely defined by specific radii and eccentricities. Students were expected to draw these diagrams, understand the relationships between the parts, and use them to predict the planet's position at a given time. This was not a passive learning experience. It demanded active geometric construction and computation. They might spend days or weeks on a single planetary model, trying to reconcile the theoretical predictions with the observational data, which was often derived from ancient Greek and Babylonian sources. Moreover, the Almagest also contained extensive star catalogs. Ptolemy meticulously listed the positions and magnitudes of over 1,000 stars, providing a fixed framework against which the planets move. Learning to use these catalogs to convert between different coordinate systems, for example, equatorial and ecliptic coordinates, and to understand the effects of precession, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis, on star positions was another layer of difficulty. The numbers were large, the calculations laborious, and the potential for error high. Beyond the mathematics, the philosophical implications of Ptolemy's work were profound. Presented a harmonious, ordered cosmos governed by predictable, if complex, mathematical laws. This resonated deeply with medieval Christian theology, which saw God as the ultimate orderer of the universe. However, reconciling the observed irregularities with the ideal of perfect circular motion presented a constant intellectual tension. Students debated whether epicycles and deferents were physically real or merely mathematical devices for prediction. The Almagest was not something a student could simply read and comprehend. It required extensive commentary, guidance from a master, and diligent practice. Many medieval scholars, particularly in the Islamic world, dedicated their lives to studying, translating, and improving upon Ptolemy's work. Figures like al-Battani and Nasir al-Din al-Tusi refined his calculations and challenged certain aspects of his models. For a student, the Almagest was a gateway to the cutting edge of ancient scientific knowledge, a demanding test of mathematical prowess, and a profound exploration of the universe's structure. Mastery of this text signified a deep understanding of the heavens, a skill vital for timekeeping, navigation, and even astrological prognostications. Number 6. Euclid's Elements. In the medieval university, before a student could even dream of wrestling with the intricacies of astronomy or philosophy, they often had to conquer the foundational text of mathematics, Euclid's Elements. This was not just a textbook, it was the ultimate training ground for logical thought, a relentless exercise in deductive reasoning that had shaped intellectual inquiry for over a millennium. Written by the Greek mathematician Euclid of Alexandria, around 300 before Common Era, the Elements was a systematic exposition of geometry and number theory, a series of definitions, axioms, postulates, and theorems that built one upon another with uncompromising rigor. The sheer logical demand of elements was formidable. Euclid started with a handful of self-evident truths, definitions like a point is that which has no part, or a line is breadthless length, and a few postulates, such as a straight line may be drawn from any one point to any other point. From these few starting points, he built an entire edifice of geometrical knowledge, proving hundreds of theorems. A student was expected not just to understand the theorems, but to reproduce the proofs, step by logical step, without omission or error. This meant internalizing a method of reasoning, where every statement had to be justified by a previous definition, axiom, or already proven theorem. The structure of the Elements is divided into 13 books. The first 4 books focus on plane geometry, including propositions about triangles, parallel lines, and quadrilaterals. Books, the 5th and V, deal with ratios and proportions, concepts essential for advanced mathematics and astronomy. Books the 7th, Fine, and I, delve into number theory, discussing prime numbers, perfect numbers, and algorithm, like the Euclidean algorithm for finding the greatest common divisor. Books the 10th addresses irrational numbers, a concept that challenged ancient Greek mathematical assumptions. Finally, books the 11th, XII, and X3 conclude with solid geometry, including the properties of spheres, cones, cylinders, and the 5 Platonic solids. Progression was relentless, each concept building upon the last, demanding continuous attention and comprehension. Consider Proposition 47 of Book 1, famously known as the Pythagorean theorem. Students had to not just remember the theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, but understand and reproduce Euclid's geometric proof. This proof involved constructing squares on each side of the right-angled triangle, drawing auxiliary lines, and demonstrating the equality of areas through a series of logical deductions. This required not only understanding the steps, but also the ability to visualize complex geometric relationships and justify each step with reference to previous definitions or theorems. If a student missed one step, the entire proof collapsed. The abstract nature of Euclidean geometry also presented a challenge. Students were not simply measuring physical objects, they were dealing with idealized concepts like perfect points, lines, and planes. Proofs were not based on empirical observation, but on pure logical deduction. This trained the mind to think abstractly, to move from general principles to specific conclusions, and to understand the nature of mathematical truth. The meticulousness required was intense. Every assumption had to be stated, every inference justified. There was no room for ambiguity or intuitive leaps. Furthermore, students learned the elements through Latin translations, which often included commentaries and scholastic interpretations. Medieval scholars like Campanus of Novara and Gerard of Cremona produced influential translations that added their own insights and explanations. This meant students were not just reading Euclid, but also engaging with generations of mathematical scholarship and differing interpretations of difficult passages. The task was not just to read, but to absorb and critically engage with this accumulated wisdom. The Elements was often taught using a combination of lectures, where masters would explain the proofs, and disputations where students would present and defend their understanding of theorems. A student might be asked to prove a specific proposition on the spot, demonstrating their mastery of the logical sequence and their ability to articulate the justification for each step. This public performance added another layer of pressure to the already demanding intellectual task. Mastering Euclid's Elements was a rite of passage for medieval scholars. It was not just about learning geometry. It was about learning how to think. The rigorous logical training instilled by Euclid's work provided the intellectual framework for studying philosophy, theology, law, and medicine. It taught precision, clarity, and the power of deductive reasoning. For students who could navigate its intricate proofs and master its logical demands, the Elements provided an unparalleled foundation for all future intellectual endeavors. It was a true test of a student's intellectual endurance and logical aptitude. Number 5. Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis. In the bustling, often chaotic world of medieval towns and kingdoms, the study of law was paramount. It was the bedrock of societal order, property rights, and justice. For students aspiring to become legal scholars, administrators, or judges, one text stood as an Everest of intellectual challenge: Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis. This colossal compilation of Roman law, commissioned by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian, the first in the 6th century Common Era, was a meticulously organized but incredibly dense collection of imperial statutes. It was not a light read. It was the entire legal system of a vast empire distilled into complex Latin and often presented in an intimidating, unindexed format. The Corpus Juris Civilis, or Body of Civil Law, is composed of four main parts: the code, codex; the digest, digesta or pandecti; the institutes, institutionuns; and the novellae, novellae constitutionis. Each part served a different purpose, and mastering them meant internalizing an entire legal universe. The code contained imperial constitutions and decrees from previous emperors. The institutes was a systematic textbook for students, designed to introduce them to the basic principles of Roman law. The novellae contained new laws enacted by Justinian himself. However, the true beast was the digest. The digest alone contained selections from the writings of classical Roman jurists, compiled from thousands of legal opinions that had accumulated over centuries. It comprised 50 books, with thousands of fragments, often contradictory or overlapping, that had to be reconciled and understood. Imagine trying to navigate a legal library without an index, where each expert had a slightly different opinion on the same concept, and you had to find the prevailing rule. The sheer volume was overwhelming. Medieval students would often be studying Latin manuscripts that lacked modern organizational aids like paragraph breaks or chapter headings. One of the central challenges was the Latin itself. It was the sophisticated, often verbose, and highly technical Latin of ancient Roman jurisprudence, distinct from the simplified Latin encountered in other texts. Legal terms had precise, nuanced meanings that could not be easily translated or approximated. Concepts like dominium, ownership, usufruct, the right to use and enjoy the fruits of another's property, and stipulatio, a formal verbal contract, were not simple definitions. They were embedded in complex legal scenarios and had subtle distinctions that determined their application. Students had to master the specialized vocabulary and the intricate grammatical structures of legal Latin. Furthermore, the corpus juris civilis represented a legal system vastly different from the feudal customs and customary law prevalent in medieval Europe. Roman law was based on abstract principles, logical deductions, and a sophisticated understanding of contracts, property, and delicts, torts. It was a written, rational system, often clashing with local unwritten traditions based on precedent and oral transmission. Students had to bridge this conceptual gap, learning a system that was both intellectually foreign and practically groundbreaking for their time. Students were expected to engage with text through glosses. Masters and students would write marginal notes, or glossae, explaining difficult terms, cross-referencing passages, and identifying potential contradictions. These glosses themselves grew into a vast body of commentary, sometimes becoming as voluminous as the original text. For a student, this meant not only understanding Justinian, but also the layers of interpretation built upon it by generations of legal scholars known as the glossators. They had to distinguish between the original text and its subsequent interpretations, and to understand the debates surrounding different interpretations. The method of study involved continuous reading, memorization of key passages, and most importantly, disputations. Students would engage in rigorous debates presenting a legal case, arguing for a particular interpretation of a law, and defending their position against a master or another student. This required not only an encyclopedic knowledge of the corpus juris civilis, but also the ability to apply its principles to novel situations, to construct compelling legal arguments, and to identify weaknesses in an opponent's reasoning. They had to learn the art of legal argumentation, which was a precise and demanding skill. Corpus juris civilis was the foundation for the revival of Roman law in Europe, profoundly influencing legal systems across the continent. Its study was a pathway to power and influence, equipping students with a universal legal language and a systematic approach to justice. But the journey through its thousands of dense paragraphs, its precise Latin, and its layered interpretations was a testament to the dedication and intellectual rigor required of medieval law students. It was a text that shaped not just legal minds, but entire legal systems for centuries to come. Number 4. Gratian's Decretum. Alongside the grand tapestry of civil law, another legal giant loomed in the medieval university curriculum: Gratian's Decretum. This massive compilation, formerly known as Concordia Discordantium Canonum, or Concordance of Discordant Canons, was assembled by the monk Gratian around 1140. It marked a pivotal moment in the history of canon law, the law of the Church. But it was also an immense intellectual challenge for any student attempting to master it. Unlike the systematic organization of Roman civil law, Gratian's work aimed to bring order to centuries of often contradictory ecclesiastical decrees, papal pronouncements, and biblical injunctions. The very title, Concordance of Discordant Canons, hinted at the complex task of reconciling disparate sources. The Decretum was not an official church code. It was a private collection, albeit one that quickly gained immense authority and became the primary textbook for canon law throughout the Middle Ages. Its complexity stemmed from its source material. Gratian gathered texts from a vast array of sources: biblical passages, decrees of church councils, letters from popes, known as decretals, writings of church fathers like Augustine and Jerome, and even secular Roman and Germanic laws. These texts were often written in different eras under different circumstances and sometimes expressed conflicting views on the same issue. Gratian's genius and the source of the Decretum's difficulty lay in his method. He presented these disparate texts, often quoted in fragments, and then added his own brief commentary or dicta, sayings. In these dicta, Gratian attempted to reconcile the contradictions through various logical techniques, such as distinguishing between different meanings of a word, identifying different circumstances of a rule's application, or recognizing a hierarchy of authority among the sources. He would present a quaestio, question, then quote authorities on both sides of the issue, and finally offer his solution, often a nuanced distinction. For a student, this meant not simply memorizing rules, but understanding the process of reconciliation. They had to learn to identify the discordia, discordal, and then follow Gratian's concordia, concordance, through a complex chain of reasoning. This required an acute understanding of logical argumentation, a skill honed through dialectic and scholastic methods. They had to discern the historical context of each canon, the authority of its source, and its relationship to other potentially contradictory norms. It was a lesson in intellectual synthesis. The Decretum is divided into 3 parts. The first part deals with the sources of law, ecclesiastical persons, and offices. The second part, by far the longest and most complex, addresses various legal cases involving marriage, penance, and ecclesiastical property, structured around specific quaestiones. The third part focuses on the liturgy and sacraments. Within these parts, the arrangement was often by topic, but the method of presenting conflicting texts and then resolving them was consistent. Students were constantly confronted with multiple viewpoints on a single legal or theological issue. Consider a typical quaestio in the Decretum. It might discuss the validity of marriage between relatives. Gratian would cite a biblical prohibition, a decree from an early church council that allowed certain marriages, and a papal letter that was stricter. The student's task was to understand how Gratian, in his dictum, explained why these seemingly contradictory statements could all be considered valid under different interpretations or circumstances. This required more than just rote learning. It demanded critical analysis of legal sources and the ability to apply nuanced distinctions. The Latin used in the Decretum was another hurdle. While perhaps less technically dense than Justinian's civil law, it spanned centuries of ecclesiastical documents, incorporating various styles and terminologies. Furthermore, the text was not always clear or consistent in its citations, and students often had to consult multiple manuscripts or commentaries to make sense of a passage. Like the Corpus Juris Civilis, the Decretum was studied with the aid of glossae. Commentators known as decretists wrote extensive marginal notes and lectures that further elucidated Gratian's distinctions and debated his conclusions. Students not only learned Gratian's solutions, but also the arguments for and against them, as presented by the leading legal minds of the day. They had to understand the sententia magistri, the master's opinion, as well as the alternative arguments. Mastering Gratian's decretum was foundational for anyone entering the church hierarchy, administering ecclesiastical courts or advising secular rulers on matters touching the church. It provided the framework for understanding the vast legal and moral authority of the medieval church. For students, it was an arduous journey through the labyrinthine history of ecclesiastical decrees, demanding a sharp legal mind, a profound grasp of Latin, and an unparalleled ability to synthesize contradictory information. Prepared them for a life of legal disputation and the immense responsibility of applying the law of God and the church. Number 3. Peter Lombard's sentences. In the towering intellectual edifice of the medieval university, especially within the faculty of theology, one text reigns supreme as both a cornerstone of learning and a formidable challenge: Peter Lombard's sentences. Written around 1150, this systematic compilation of theological doctrines, opinions of church fathers, and scriptural passages was formally known as Libri Quatuor Sententiarum, 4 books of sentences. It served as the standard textbook for theological study for centuries, and nearly every significant theologian from the 13th century onwards wrote a commentary on it. For a student, mastering the sentences meant grappling with the entire spectrum of Christian doctrine, often presented through complex scholastic distinctions and arguments. The sentences was organized into 4 books. Book 1 dealt with God, the Trinity, and divine attribute. Book the 2nd covered creation, angels, the fall of humanity and sin. Book the 3rd focused on the incarnation of Christ, redemption, virtues, and the gifts of the Holy Spirit. Book the 4th addressed the sacraments, eschatology, the study of last things like heaven, hell, and the last judgment, and resurrection. This systematic approach, however, did not imply simplicity. Lombard aimed to collect the authoritative statements, or sentences, of church fathers like Augustine, Jerome, Ambrose, and Gregory the Great, alongside scriptural passages and decrees from councils, and to reconcile their apparent contradictions. The primary difficulty stemmed from the method of scholastic inquiry. Lombard, like Gratian, presented various sententiae, opinions from different authorities on a given theological question. These opinions were often in tension, reflecting diverse interpretations of Scripture or differing emphasis among the fathers. The student's task was to understand these distinctions, to follow Lombard's subtle attempts at reconciliation, and eventually to form their own reasoned theological arguments. This required not only immense memorization of doctrines and patristic quotes, but also a profound grasp of logic and dialect. Consider a question such as the nature of divine foreknowledge and human free will, a perennial theological problem. Lombard would present passages from Augustine emphasizing God's omniscient foreknowledge, which seemed to imply a predetermined fate. Then he would present other passages from Augustine or other fathers stressing human moral responsibility and the ability to choose. A student had to follow Lombard's careful distinctions, which often involved parsing complex Latin, philosophical terms, to understand how these seemingly contradictory truths could coexist within the framework of Christian doctrine. This often led to debates about subtle metaphysical points. The language of the sentences was Latin, but it was a Latin infused with philosophical and theological precision. Concepts like substance, accident, person, nature, essence, and subsistence were used with highly specific meanings derived from Aristotelian metaphysics and Neoplatonic thought. Students needed to master this specialized vocabulary to understand the intricate arguments about the Trinity, the 2 natures of Christ, or the efficacy of the sacraments. A slight misunderstanding of a single term could lead to profound theological error. The structure of the sentences facilitated the development of a unique pedagogical method known as the quaestio disputata. Masters would pose a question often directly from Lombard's text, and students would debate it, presenting arguments for and against a particular position, citing authorities, and attempting to resolve the difficulty. This was a highly demanding intellectual exercise. It required the student to not only know the sentences intimately, but also to be able to apply its principles, construct logical arguments, defend their positions, and identify weaknesses in opposing views. The ultimate goal was to articulate a sententia, their own reasoned opinion, that was orthodox and well supported. Furthermore, the sentences provided the framework for the development of scholastic theology. Major figures like Thomas Aquinas, Bonaventure, Duns Scotus, and William of Ockham all wrote extensive commentaries on Lombard's work, which became their own seminal contributions to theology. For subsequent generations of students, this meant not only engaging with Lombard's original text, but also navigating the vast and complex landscape of commentaries written by intellectual giants. They had to understand Lombard's original intent, the interpretations offered by different schools of thought, and the ongoing debates that defined theological inquiry. Mastering Peter Lombard's sentences was the ultimate test for a medieval theologian. It instilled a rigorous method of systematic inquiry, taught the precision of theological language, and exposed students to the full sweep of Christian doctrine and its historical development. It was a journey through the deepest mysteries of faith, demanding not only intellect but also spiritual commitment. The student who successfully navigated its complexities emerged not just as a scholar, but as a potential master capable of contributing to the ongoing theological conversation. Number 2. Aristotle's posterior analytics. When medieval students arrived at the Faculty of Arts, their journey into advanced philosophy and natural science was often prefaced by an encounter with the rigorous demands of Aristotle's posterior analytics. This was not a book about what to think, but how to think scientifically, written by Aristotle in the 4th century before Common Era. This treatise was a foundational text in logic and epistemology, dealing with the nature of scientific knowledge, demonstration, and proof. It was short in length, but dense in content, forming a critical component of the organon Aristotle's collected works on logic. For a medieval student, understanding the posterior analytics was essential for any systematic inquiry into knowledge, but it posed significant intellectual hurdles. The central aim of the posterior analytics is to explain how true scientific knowledge, or episteme, is acquired. Aristotle argued that such knowledge is gained through demonstration, which is a specific type of syllogism that produces certain, universal, and necessary conclusions from premises that are themselves certain and known. This concept was incredibly abstract. Students had to differentiate between mere belief or opinion, doxa, and true scientific knowledge, understanding that the latter required understanding why something is the case, not just that it is the case. This meant moving beyond simple observation to causal explanation. Primary challenge came from the book's focus on the structure of scientific demonstration. Aristotle meticulously laid out the characteristics of proper scientific premises. They must be true, primary, immediate, better known than and prior to the conclusion and causes of the conclusion. Consider the concept of primary and immediate. This meant that the premises themselves could not be derived from other premises but must be self-evident or directly apprehended. For medieval students, grappling with this concept involved understanding how to identify ultimate principles in any given field of study, whether it was mathematics, physics, or theology. Aristotle also introduced the idea of propter hoc demonstration, which means demonstrating through the cause. For example, knowing that planets are close because they do not twinkle is different from knowing that planets do not twinkle because they are close. The posterior analytics pushed students to identify the causal links in their reasoning, to seek out the underlying reasons for observed phenomena. This required a level of analytical rigor that went far beyond everyday thought. Another significant difficulty was the theory of definition and classification. Aristotle discussed how scientific knowledge relies on precise definitions of terms and the division of genera into species. Students had to learn how to form proper definitions, distinguishing between essential attributes and accidental properties. This process was crucial for constructing valid arguments and for avoiding logical fallacies. For instance, defining human being as a rational animal required understanding what makes rationality an essential property rather than an accidental one. Text was written in highly concentrated Greek prose, which medieval students accessed through Latin translations, often accompanied by Arabic commentaries, particularly those of Averroes. These translations and commentaries, while helpful, could also add layers of interpretation that students had to navigate. The Latin philosophical vocabulary itself was dense with terms like propter quid, on account of what, and quia, that which is the case, indicating different kinds of knowledge. Students learned the posterior analytics in the context of the medieval scholastic method. Masters would lecture on the text, dissecting each sentence and explaining Aristotle's intricate logical structure. Students were expected to participate in disputations where they would apply the principles of demonstration to specific questions, proving their conclusions from certain premises. This involved formulating syllogisms, defending their premises, and showing how their conclusions followed necessarily. It was a rigorous training in intellectual precision and argumentative discipline. Mastering the posterior analytics was not just about memorizing rules of logic. It was about internalizing a profound method of scientific inquiry. Taught students how to construct knowledge, how to differentiate between mere assertion and demonstrated truth, and how to identify the fundamental principles within any domain of study. It was a cornerstone of the arts curriculum, preparing students for advanced studies in theology, medicine, and law, where rigorous logical demonstration was prized above all else. For medieval scholars, this text was the ultimate guide to thinking critically and systematically about the world. Number 1. At the pinnacle of intellectual challenge for medieval students, especially those in the Faculty of Arts aspiring to advanced studies in theology, stood Aristotle's Metaphysics. This collection of 14 books, compiled and edited long after Aristotle's death, in the 4th century before Common Era, delved into the most fundamental questions of existence, reality, and knowledge. Its very name, metaphysics, literally meaning after physics, suggested its scope. It went beyond the physical world to explore the underlying principles of being itself. For a medieval student, usually encountering it through Latin translations of Greek and Arabic commentaries, it was a dizzying journey into the most abstract reaches of human thought, demanding an unparalleled level of intellectual sophistication. Core difficulty of the metaphysics lay in its subject matter, being qua being. This meant studying existence itself, not just specific kinds of existing things, like plants or animals, which were studied in physics. Aristotle explored concepts like substance, essence, actuality and potentiality, causality, unity, plurality, and ultimate reality. These were not concepts that could be observed or easily grasped. They required pure abstract reasoning. For example, Aristotle's concept of substance distinguished between the independent existence of things, like a human being or a tree, and their accidents, like their color or size, which depend on a substance for their existence. Understanding this distinction was fundamental to all further philosophical and theological inquiry. Aristotle introduced the notion of the 4 causes: material, formal, efficient, and final. A student had to understand how these 4 types of causes explained everything in existence. For a statue, the material cause is the bronze, the formal cause is the shape of the statue, the efficient cause is the sculptor, and the final cause is its purpose, like honoring a deity. Applying this framework to complex phenomena, and eventually to the very nature of God, required deep analytical skill. Concept of the prime mover, an unmoved mover that causes all motion in a universe by being its ultimate final cause, the object of desire and thought, was particularly challenging as it transcended any physical analogy. The metaphysics was also notoriously difficult due to its structure. It was not a single unified treatise, but a collection of lectures and essays that often returned to similar themes from different angles, sometimes with subtle shifts in argument. This lack of a clear linear narrative meant students had to piece together Aristotle's overall argument from disparate sections, integrating insights from different books. The Greek terms were often dense, and their Latin translations, while masterful in their own right, sometimes struggled to capture the full nuance of Aristotle's original thought. Terms like huesia, often translated as substance or essence, or energeia, actuality, carried immense philosophical weight. Medieval students would have studied the metaphysics in the context of the scholastic method, which involved extensive lecturing, commentary, and disputation. Masters like Thomas Aquinas wrote monumental commentaries, breaking down each section, explaining Aristotle's arguments, and reconciling them with Christian theology. Students had to engage not just with Aristotle's original text, but with these layers of interpretation. The influence of Arabic philosophers like Avicenna and Averroes, whose commentaries deeply shaped the understanding of Aristotle in the Latin West, added another layer of intellectual complexity. Students had to differentiate between Aristotle's original meaning and the interpretations, often Neoplatonic, presented by Arabic scholars. The metaphysics also engaged in profound debates with Plato's theory of forms, a rival philosophical system. Aristotle criticized Plato's idea that true reality exists in a separate realm of perfect, immutable forms. Instead, Aristotle argued that universals exist within particular things. Understanding this critique and the subtleties of Aristotle's own realism required a sophisticated grasp of both philosophical traditions. For the aspiring theologian, mastery of the metaphysics was indispensable. It provided the philosophical tools and vocabulary to discuss the nature of God, the soul, creation, and ultimate reality. Concepts like divine simplicity, the relationship between God's essence and existence, and the nature of angels and disembodied intellects were discussed using the rigorous framework provided by Aristotle. Without a firm grasp of terms like act and potency, form and matter, or substance and accident, the most advanced theological arguments remained unintelligible. The metaphysics represented the pinnacle of philosophical inquiry in the medieval period, a text that pushed the boundaries of human reason to its limits. For students, it was a getting encounter, shaping their understanding of reality, causality, and the very nature of being. Its study demanded not only intellectual rigor, but also a profound capacity for abstract thought, making it arguably the toughest text a medieval student had to master. It was the ultimate test of their philosophical mettle, preparing them to wrestle with the biggest questions about the universe and their place within it.